And the former Australian ambassador to the United Nations and head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Richard Woolcott, joins me now. Richard Woolcott, welcome. So should Australia join the campaign against Islamic State inside Syria or not?
Well, good morning, Joe. Yeah, I've always had concerns about that. I think the issue is not so much these sort of peripheral issues have come up, whether we sought the American request to do it or not, but I think the real issue is whether we should be involved in what is a very complex civil war. If you go back in time, I recall Prime Minister Tony Abbott once, I think late last year, describing what was going on in Syria and the Middle East as baddies versus baddies. And that was not a bad summary of what the situation is. But I find it a matter of concern that we've got involved in the Middle East. It's not really our part of the world. We can only make a relatively peripheral contribution. And I think there are three main dangers. One is whether or not involvement is in fact in a civil war. Secondly, whether Western involvement in particular is in some ways beneficial to the IS, because I've recently been in Indonesia on a private visit because I have a married daughter there, but I had some very interesting discussions in Indonesia with one minister and some old friends, and I found quite a widespread view in Indonesia as to that Western intervention in the Middle East tends to create more terrorists than it removes. And I'm not sure that's an issue we've ever thoroughly addressed, or what intelligence we have on that, but we need to remember that when we got involved in the second invasion of Iraq, which has turned out to be a major disaster, we acted on the basis of bad intelligence and on assumptions that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't. And I just feel that, and to quote another brief Tony Abbott comment, which again summed up the situation well, when he said in foreign policy we need less Geneva and more Jakarta. And I think what he was implying was there should be a greater focus on our own region, on Asia, Asia Pacific, than on areas like Europe and the Middle East.
So from what you're saying there, it seems clear that your opinion is Australia should not be joining this campaign against Islamic State inside Syria.
Well, we are, of course, already there.
Yep.
That's part of the problem. But as I said before, I don't think the issue is how we got there now, because we are there. And again, whether we requested the Americans to make the request, which is what we've done in the past, but the issue now is should we get further involved. Now, all the military people I talk to say you cannot win this just by bombing. Now, it's quite clear that the United States and other countries are not prepared to put troops on the ground, and why should they? It's a very complicated civil war, and the main opponents of ISIS in Syria is Assad himself, and the main country which opposes the IS is Iran. And in some sense you've got Saudi Arabia and the Sunnis on one side, and Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen in a very rather messy and nasty way. And on the other side, you've got Iraq, or what's left of Iraq, and the Shiites. And this is just, I think, a long-term mess. and I cannot see the great advantages to us in being involved. Now, people say this.
But the mess is having effects outside that region, isn't it? And that we see these. Julie Bishop was talking about this morning. I think 40%. She was saying 40% of the migrants to Europe now are coming from Syria. We're seeing this great humanitarian crisis. Isn't there a moral obligation on the rest of the world to do all it can to address its situation and stop this humanitarian disaster?
Yeah, I think there is a moral obligation to address this sort of outpouring of refugees, and some European countries like Germany are doing very well. But it doesn't seem to me that supporting bombing parts of Syria, that'll probably create more refugees rather than less. So I can't see the logic in that. You mentioned a moral obligation. I think that's true, but countries have moral obligations, I think, only if they're a party principle in the situation. Now, we're not a party principle. Our influence is, although it's quite large, we're the second largest contributor after the United States, is still essentially peripheral. We can't solve this problem. And even in Turkey, there's been some support by us on because Turkey's now come in to bomb the IS, but at the same time, Turkey is trying to kill off the Kurds. I mean, this is all part of a very complex situation. It's a
very complicated situation. But so, what then is the solution to the problem that is Islamic State?
Well, I think in the end it has to be solved by the Arab states. It's going to take a long time. One can't be sure how it will be resolved. For example, if Assad were to fall, and he's already being supported by Russia, of course, which makes it more difficult, we still have no idea who's going to replace him. I mean, the IS is a sort of different groups of Islamic extremists in Iraq itself and in Syria and other parts of the world. And nobody quite knows. We don't know the outcome. We don't know who might, if Assad was bombed out of existence, which I don't think is likely to happen, we don't know who's going to be taking over.
Now, you're a diplomat, so obviously your words are very carefully chosen and diplomatic, but Cabinet is considering this issue at the moment. We're expecting a decision on this week, and it seems from what you're saying that there is no way Australia should be extending its operations in that theatre whatsoever.
Well, I prefer us not to be there at all and be focusing on our own part of the world. Yeah. Now, on that issue, of course, when I was in Indonesia, there was a widespread view, why doesn't Australia consult Indonesia, which is the largest Islamic country in the world, and a very moderate Islamic country, about what to do on these sort of Middle Eastern issues? And we don't. And there is no other country in our part of the world, amongst the ASEAN countries, including Singapore, who, while they're all concerned about what the IS is doing, they're not really intervening because we're the only one. New Zealand and Australia are the only two countries which are intervening, and of course we are seen as Western countries, and goes back to this issue which the Indonesians and other countries like Singapore, where I've been recently, make the point that Western intervention does not necessarily help, because it is Western intervention when the Arabs in the end have to solve these problems themselves. We're partly responsible because it's Western or American policy that in some ways has led to the removal of a number of heads of government in that area, in Libya, of course, and
just one other point on this. There are reports that Australia actually requested the US to ask Australia to join the campaign in Syria. Is that how you understand this did in fact happen?
Well, I don't know exactly what happened, but my instinct is that is what did happen. It's what happened in Vietnam, and really we encouraged the United States to undertake the second invasion of Iraq in 2003. But that's not the present government, those were previous governments, but there's a bit of a history of this. But as I said before, I don't think that's the issue as to how the request came. The issue is, should we be there at all in what is a complex civil war which we can't really influence the outcome, let alone even know what the outcome might be.
Okay, well, Dick Woolcott, it's always very enlightening chatting to you. Thanks so much for coming in, and we'll find out later this week what that cabinet decision is.
Well, I've got a fair idea of what it's going to be. But,
we do indeed.
Because once you get into these situations, it's difficult to extract yourself.
Yeah.
What I find difficult is we seem to want to get further into it.
Okay, Richard Woolcott, thanks for coming in.
Okay, thanks.